Hello there. In this video, we're going to learn about the evolution of Toronto's streetcar network. Now, before I get into it, I want to make a couple of clarifications. First of all, I will only be talking about the mainline routes. I won't be looking at things like the special exhibition services, tripper cars, or temporary diversions. Secondly, for the sake of clarity, I'm going to be using the modern street names, since some streets had different names in the past. And finally, this will only be a general overview. If you're looking for something more detailed on a specific route, I have an entire playlist where I run down each streetcar line in much more depth. So, with that out of the way, let's get into the video. The story of Toronto's streetcar network begins in 1849 when a cabinet maker, Bert Williams, established the first public transit route in Toronto. Using carriages he built himself, the Williams Omnibus line would run stagecoaches from the St. Lawrence Market along King Street and Yonge Street to the Red Line Hotel in the village of Yorkville. Ridership would grow on this line, and within a year the Williams Omnibus route was operating with 12 stagecoaches running at 10-minute intervals. The fare for a single ride was 6 pence. The city of Toronto would take notice of this success and in 1861 would bring in American Alex Easton to help establish Toronto and Canada's first streetcar line. On July 22nd, Alex would establish the Toronto Street Railway and the city would grant the TSR a 30-year operating charter to operate streetcar service in Toronto. On October 10, 1861, the first streetcar line in Canada would begin operations using horse-drawn cars on a route running from the St. Lawrence Market to the Yorkville Town Hall at Scollard Street via King Street and Yonge Street. This route would be known as the Yonge streetcar. Bert Williams would modify his carriages to operate along the newly installed steel rails as they offered a smoother ride. Ultimately, though, he could not compete with the Toronto Street Railway, which had more money and the backing of the city. So in 1862, the Williams Omnibus line would close up shop after 13 years of service. Williams would return to his old cabinet-making business. At this time, the streetcar network would see its first expansion when the TSR constructed new tracks along Queen Street to what is today Ossington Avenue. For a time, this route would be operated by the Yonge streetcar as well, but eventually service along Queen Street would be broken off into its own line called the Queen streetcar, one of many routes that will have this name. At some point after 1873, the Yonge streetcar would be extended south to Union Station via Front Street. In 1874, the King streetcar was established. This route would run along King Street from the Don River to Bathurst Street. In November, the Sherbourne streetcar would be established. This route would run from the intersection of Front and York Streets east along King Street, north on Sherbourne Street, east on Carleton Street, and north on Parliament Street to a Y at Winchester Street. In 1875, on the east side of the Don River, the Toronto Gravel Road and Concrete Company would construct a freight tramway between the Don River gravel pits and the intersection of Kingston Road and Main Street. While this line was primarily a freight line hauling gravel, it would also carry a small number of passengers. In 1876, the King streetcar would be extended west to Niagara Street. In 1878, the freight tramway would be extended east to Victoria Park Avenue. As well, the Sherbourne streetcar's northern terminus would be rerouted to the intersection of Sherbourne and Bloor Streets. It's possible the route maintained a branch service to Winchester Street, though. Finally, 1878 would see the start of service for the Spadina streetcar, which ran on Spadina Avenue between College and King Streets. In 1879, the King streetcar would be extended west to Strawn Avenue. Tracks would be installed on Strawn south to Wellington Street for service to the Canadian National Exhibition. In 1881, the Church streetcar would enter service, with this route running from Union Station east on Front Street and north on Church Street to Bloor Street. In July of 1881, the Winchester streetcar would enter service. This route would operate from Union Station, east on Front Street, north on Church, east on King Street, north on Sherburne, east on Carlton Street, north on Parliament Street, and then east on Winchester Street to a Y at Shumock Street. In November, the Parliament streetcar would enter service. This route would operate from Union Station, east on Front Street, north on Church, east on Queen Street, and north on Parliament Street to Gerrard Street. In 1882, the Brockton streetcar would enter service. This route ran from the intersection of Front and George Streets, west on King Street, north on Yonge Street, west on Queen Street, north on Ossington Avenue, and then west on Dundas Street to Dufferin Street. In 1883, the Spadina streetcar would be extended north to Bloor Street. The Brockton streetcar would be extended west to Lansdowne Avenue in the village of Brockton in 1884. For the 1884 Canadian National Exhibition, the Belgian Charles van Depoele constructed a short electrified railway line from the exhibition ground entrance to the Crystal Palace. This short line was a major success with exhibition goers. In 1885, the Seton Village streetcar would enter service. This route would operate from the intersection of Bathurst and Bloor Streets, south to College Street, east to Spadina Avenue, south to King Street, east to Frederick Street, and then south to Front Street. That same year, the Yonge streetcar would be extended north from Yorkville Town Hall to the CP railway tracks. Finally, that same year, the Metropolitan Street Railway would be established. This company would operate a single interurban line along Yonge Street from the CP railway tracks north to Eglinton Avenue in the village of Eglinton. In August of 1886, the Carlton streetcar would enter service. This route would run from the intersection of College and Bathurst Streets, east along College and Carlton Streets to Parliament Street, south to Gerrard Street, and then east to Shumock Street. In 1888, the city of Toronto would annex the village of Riverdale, and with it, the freight tramway would cease operations. That same year, on September 24th, the Dovercourt via McCall streetcar would enter service. This route would run from the intersection of Dovercourt and Bloor Streets, south to College Street, east to McCall Street, south to Queen Street, east to York Street, south to King Street, and then east to an on-street loop via Frederick, Front, and Church Streets. In 1889, the Lee Avenue streetcar would enter service. This route would run from the St. Lawrence Market, east on King and Queen Streets to Lee Avenue. 1889 would also see the establishment of the Bathurst streetcar, which operated from the intersection of Frederick and Front Streets, west on King Street and north on Bathurst Street to the CP rail tracks at DuPont Street. That same day, the Davenport streetcar would also be established. This route would follow the exact same route as the Seton Village streetcar, except the Davenport car would operate to the CP rail tracks at DuPont Street. Finally, the Dufferin streetcar would be established. This route would follow the Dovercourt via McCall streetcar, although the Dufferin streetcar would continue west to Dufferin Street. On May 29, 1890, the Bloor streetcar would enter service, although it would be operated by the city as the TSR's operating charter was set to expire. This route first operated along Bloor Street between Sherburne and Clinton Streets, but was quickly extended west to Christie Street. In 1891, the operating charter for the Toronto Street Railway would end. After the TSR's operating charter had expired, the city would briefly attempt to run the network on their own, but quickly decided to hand the company over to a new operator. On September 1, 1891, the Toronto Railway Company would be given a 30-year charter to run the city's streetcar network. The first thing the TRC would set out to do was electrify the city's streetcar network, as residents and riders had been calling for this since the 1884 exhibition showed off the merits of electrified streetcars. As well, by this point the Metropolitan Railway had electrified its inner urban line, so naturally Toronto residents were feeling a little left out. Over the next 5 years, the TRC would electrify the entire streetcar network, starting with the Church streetcar. In 1891, the City and Suburban Electric Railway would begin service on its Crescent streetcar, which served the village of West Toronto. The Crescent streetcar would run from the intersection of Dundas and Keele Streets west to Gilmore Avenue, east on St. John's Road, and south on Fairview Avenue to Evelyn Crescent. On May 27th, the King streetcar would be extended west to Dufferin Street. On September 21st, the Beltline streetcar would enter service. This route would operate in a loop via Bloor Street, Sherbourne Street, King Street, and Spadina Avenue. Service on the Sherbourne and Spadina streetcars would be ended as their routes had now been merged into the Beltline. That same day, the King and Lee Avenue streetcars would be merged into a single route. On September 30th, service on the Dufferin streetcar would be ended. Finally, on October 23rd, the Winchester and Davenport streetcars would be merged. This merger, however, would only last a couple of weeks, and both the Davenport and Seton Village streetcars would both be abolished. In 1892, the Metropolitan Street Railway extended its inner urban line to Glen Echo Road in the village of York Mills. On July 16, 1892, the Toronto and Mimico Railway and Light Company would begin operations on its Mimico interurban line. This route would run from the intersection of Roncesvalles and Queen Street and run west along Lakeshore Boulevard to the Humber River. On August 16th, Church streetcars would be extended east on Bloor Street and north on Sherbourne Street to the new Rosedale Loop. On September 5th, the Bathurst streetcar would be extended south to Front Street and then run east to Frederick Street. That same day, the Dovercourt via McCall streetcar would see a slight revision in its route, as it would now Y at Frederick Street. The route would then double back on itself, running west on Front Street and north on York Street. On September 6th, the Davenport Street Railway would begin service on its Davenport streetcar. This route would primarily connect the communities of Carleton, Brackendale, and Davenport to the city of Toronto and the village of West Toronto. The Davenport streetcar would run from the intersection of Keele Street and Dundas Street, north to St. Clair Avenue, east to Ford Street, south to Davenport Road, and then east to Bathurst Street, where it would terminate at the CP rail tracks. On September 26th, the Winchester streetcar would be rerouted, with the line now running north on Church Street to Carleton Street before heading east to its normal route. On October 28th, the King streetcar would be extended west to Roncesvalles Avenue. On June 30th, 1893, the King streetcar would be extended east to Balsam Avenue. On July 1st, the Toronto and Scarborough Electric Railway Light and Power Company would begin operations on its Scarborough interurban line. This line would operate along Kingston Road between Queen Street and Blantyre Avenue. The T&SER would also build a branch line south on Blantyre Avenue to the intersection of Queen Street and Victoria Park Avenue. On July 10th, service on the Mimico Interurban was extended west to the Mimico Creek, and by September 29th, the route had been extended further west to Kipling Avenue in the village of New Toronto. On September 28th, the Winchester streetcar would once again be rerouted, with the line now running north on Yonge Street to Carleton Street before running east to its normal route. On October 9th, the Brockton streetcar would be renamed to the Dundas streetcar. In November, the College streetcar would enter service. This route would start at the intersection of Church and Front Streets and run north to King Street, west to Yonge Street, north to College Street, and west to a Y at Bathurst Street. In 1894, the T&SER would open a new branch on its Scarborough Interurban to better serve the village of East Toronto. This branch would run north on Walter Street, west on Lyle Avenue, north on Kimberley Avenue, and then west on Gerrard Street to Main Street. In January of 1894, the Winchester and Parliament streetcars would be merged on a trial run basis. This new route would run from Union Station east to Church Street, north to King Street, east to Sherbourne Street, north to Queen Street, east to Parliament Street, north to Winchester Street, and then east to Shumock Street. That same month, the Davenport Street Railway and the City and Suburban Electric Railway would merge to become the Toronto Suburban Railway Company. On April 14th, the Dundas streetcar would be extended west to Humberside Avenue. On October 16th, the Parliament and Winchester cars would be split, and the Winchester car would instead be merged with the Bathurst streetcar. This route would now run south on Bathurst Street from the CP rail tracks to King Street. It would then run east to York Street, south to Front Street, east to Yonge Street, north to Carlton Street, east to Parliament Street, north to Winchester Street, and then east to a Y at Shumock Street. 1894 would also see an extension of the TSR's Crescent streetcar to Humberside Avenue to connect with the Dundas streetcar. Finally, the service on the Dovercourt via McCall streetcar would be ended in 1894. In 1895, a new off-street loop at Union Station called Station Loop would open. On January 26th, the Bathurst and Winchester streetcars would be split back into their pre-merger routes. On July 1st, service on the Mimico Interurban was extended west to the Etobicoke Creek in the village of Long Branch. On September 16th, the Dovercourt streetcar would enter service. This route would operate from a Y at the intersection of Dovercourt and Bloor Streets, south to College Street, east to Ossington Avenue, and then south to a Y at Queen Street. 1895 would also see the TSR expand its network with the introduction of the Weston Interurban Line, which operated from the intersection of Keele and Dundas to Church Street in the village of Weston. Finally, the TSR would also begin service on the Lambton streetcar, which operated on Dundas Street from Humberside Avenue to Lambton Park. On January 1st of 1896, the Bloor streetcar would be renamed to the Bloor and McCall streetcar, and a branch of the route would now run down Yonge Street to Front Street. In May, the Bloor and McCall streetcar would be extended west to Lansdowne Road. In December, the southern terminus of the Winchester streetcar would change as it would now perform an on-street loop via Yonge Street, Front Street, York Street, and King Street. In 1897, service on the Blantyre branch of the T&SER's Scarborough Interurban was ended and the tracks torn up. On February 1st, service on the Metropolitan Interurban line was extended to Lorne Avenue in Richmond Hill. On July 23rd, the Dovercourt streetcar would be extended north to a Y at DuPont Street. In 1898, service on the Scarborough Interurban line would be extended east to Warden Avenue in the township of Scarborough. 1898 would also see an extension of the King streetcar east to Monroe Park. In 1899, service on the Metropolitan Interurban would be extended to Newmarket. The line would run along Yonge Street to Mullock Drive. It then broke off from Yonge Street and crossed the fields on its own right-of-way before following what is today Tom Taylor Trail. The route then ran north on Main Street to its terminus at Timothy Street. On December 23rd, the TRC would gain running rights into the village of West Toronto, and so the Dundas streetcar would be extended west to Keele Street to better connect with the TSR's services. On July 12, 1901, service on the Scarborough Interurban Line would be extended to Midland Avenue. On February 12, 1902, the Arthur streetcar would enter service. This route would run from the intersection of Dundas and Ossington Streets east to Bathurst Street and south to King Street. 2 days later, on February 14th, the Dovercourt streetcar would be extended east along Queen Street and south on Shaw Street to a Y at King Street. On February 6, 1903, the Avenue Road streetcar would begin service. This route would operate from the intersection of Avenue Road and St. Clair, south to Bloor Street, east to Yonge Street, south to Front Street, and then west to Station Loop. This route would also have a branch line that operated along DuPont Street between Avenue Road and Kendall Avenue. On November 6th, the Arthur streetcar would be extended south on Bathurst Street to Front Street and then east to George Street. Lastly, the T&MER would rebrand itself to the Toronto and Mimico Railway Company. In 1904, Sir William Mackenzie would purchase the Metropolitan Street Railway, the Toronto and Mimico Railway, and the Toronto and Scarborough Electric Railway, merging them all together to form the Toronto and York Radial Railway. In 1905, service on the Metropolitan Interurban would be altered slightly as a new terminal was constructed in Newmarket on Botsford Street across from the Town Hall. On January 23, 1905, service on the Scarborough Interurban Line would be extended to Bellamy Road. 12 months later, on December 24th, the Scarborough Interurban would once again see its service extended, this time to Markham Road. That same day, service on the Mimico Interurban Line would be extended west to Hurontario Street in the village of Port Credit. On August 29, 1906, the branch of the Avenue Road streetcar to Kendall Avenue would be spun off into its own route, that being the DuPont streetcar. The route would also be extended west to Bathurst Street. 2 days later, on August 31st, the Scarborough Interurban would reach its final terminus with an extension east to Fairwood Crescent in West Hill. 2 months later, on October 11th, service on the Bathurst streetcar would be extended west along DuPont Street to a Y at Christie Street. Finally, on November 19th, service on the Mimico Interurban would reach its final terminus with an extension west to the Credit River. On June 1, 1907, service on the Metropolitan Interurban would be extended north to Jackson Point, following its own right-of-way out of Newmarket and then running north along Metro Road North. On July 14th, the Arthur streetcar would be changed. It would now begin at a Y at the intersection of Lansdowne and Bloor. It would then head south to Dundas Street, east to Bathurst Street, south to Queen Street, east to York Street, and then follow an on-street loop via Richmond Street, Victoria Street, and Queen Street. On January 1, 1909, the Metropolitan Interurban would reach its final terminus with an extension to Sutton running south on Dalton Road. On November 11th, the Bloor streetcar would be restored. The route itself would operate between Lansdowne Avenue and Church Street. Bloor and McCall streetcars would still run but would now operate south on Ossington Avenue and east on Harbour Street to Spadina Avenue. Finally, in 1909, the Arthur and Dundas streetcars would be merged into a single route. As part of this merger, service on Lansdowne Avenue between Dundas and Bloor Streets would be ended. By 1910, the Parliament streetcar had seen a change in its route. The route now operated from a Y at the intersection of Gerrard Street and Greenwood Avenue, east to Parliament Street, south to Queen Street, and then east on an on-street loop via Yonge Street, Front Street, and Bay Street. By August 28, 1910, the College streetcar had seen its service changed. The route now operated from High Park Loop, east on College Street, and south on Yonge Street to an on-street loop via Front Street, Scott Street, and Wellington Street. The Carlton streetcar by this point had also been changed. It now operated from a Y at Lansdowne and DuPont, south to College Street, east to Parliament Street, south to Gerrard Street, and east to Broadview Avenue. Finally, at some point in 1910, the Dundas streetcar had also seen a change to its route. It would now continue east on Dundas Street to Bay Street before heading south to Queen Street and performing its pre-existing on-street loop. On November 16, 1911, the Harvard streetcar would enter service. This route would start at a Y at the intersection of Ossington and Bloor Street, head south to Harbord Street and east to Spadina Avenue, south to Adelaide Street, and then east to a Y at Church Street. This would also end service on the Bloor and McCall streetcar. On December 18th, the Winchester streetcar would see a change to its route. It would now start at a Y at the intersection of Victoria and Adelaide Streets, run north to Dundas Street, east to Parliament, north to Winchester Street, and then east to a Y at Shumock Street. By 1912, the city of Toronto had annexed many of its neighbours but had grown frustrated with the Toronto Railway Company's refusal to extend service into these areas. Entering into the final decade of its operating charter, the TRC simply saw no monetary value in extending its services into the more far-flung areas of Toronto, nor did it have any contractual obligation to. With this in mind, the City of Toronto would decide to construct its own lines into the newly annexed areas of the city, and so the municipally owned Toronto Civic Railway would be formed. On April 1, 1912, the Winchester streetcar would see a change to its southern end of its route. It would now perform an on-street loop via Victoria Street, Adelaide Street, Church Street, and Richmond Street. On December 18, 1912, the TCR's first route would enter service, that being the Gerrard streetcar. This route would operate from the intersection of Gerrard and Greenwood Avenue, run east to Coxwell Avenue, north to Upper Gerrard Street, and then east to Main Street. On August 25, 1913, the Toronto Civic Railway would open its second streetcar route, that being the St. Clair streetcar. This route would operate from the intersection of Yonge Street and St. Clair to the Grand Trunk Railway tracks at Caledonia Road. 1913 would also see the start of the TCR's third streetcar route, that being the Danforth streetcar. This route would operate from Broadview Avenue to Luttrell Avenue. Finally, the T&SER would close the Walter Street branch of its Scarborough Interurban as local residents preferred to use the Gerrard streetcar to commute downtown. 1914 would see the outbreak of the First World War, and over the next 4 years, the city's streetcar network would be worked harder than ever before. Due to the rationing of materials like rubber, oil, and steel, residents would come to rely on the streetcars to get around, and the streetcars would have to do so on reduced maintenance. In September of 1914, the Dufferin streetcar would enter service. This was a short shuttle service operating from the intersection of Dufferin and King Streets to Dufferin Loop at the exhibition grounds. The military had requested this route as the exhibition grounds were being used as a staging area for troops and supplies heading to Europe. The TRC, however, did not want to operate this line, and over the next 4 years the route would come and go at random, much to the military's annoyance. October 10th would see the Toronto Suburban Railway begin operations on its second interurban line, that being the Woodbridge Interurban. This route would follow the Weston Interurban into the village of Weston. From there it would run north on Weston Road, Albion Road, and Kipling Avenue. After Steeles Avenue, the route would run on its own right-of-way to its terminus near Woodbridge Avenue and Clarence Street. Lastly, on December 24th, the King streetcar would be extended east to a Y at Neville Park Boulevard. On February 23, 1915, the city would install tracks on Bloor Street between Dundas Street and Quebec Avenue. These tracks would be used as a branch of the Bloor streetcar. Later that year, this western branch of the Bloor streetcar would be extended further west to Runnymede Road. Finally, in 1915, the Yonge streetcar would be extended north to Woodlawn Avenue. On June 1, 1916, the Harvard streetcar route would be changed. The route would now operate from a Y at the intersection of Lappin and Lansdowne Avenues, east to Dufferin Street, south to Hallam Street, east to Ossington Avenue, south to Harvard Street, east to Spadina Avenue, and south to an on-street loop via Adelaide, Church, and Richmond Streets. On January 16, 1917, the TCR would begin operations on the Lansdowne streetcar. This route would operate on Lansdowne Avenue between St. Clair Avenue and the CP rail tracks. On August 12th, the TSR would begin operations on its third and final interurban line, that being the Guelph interurban. After leaving the terminal at Keele and Dundas, the route would largely follow its own private right-of-way to its terminus at the intersection of Gordon Street and James Street East in Guelph. Finally, on November 5th, the Ashbridge streetcar would enter service. This route ran on its own right-of-way from Queen Street and the East Don Roadway south to Commissioner Street and then west to Cherry Street. In 1918, the Parliament streetcar would be merged with the Queen streetcar and the new route extended west to Roncesvalles Avenue. This route would also have a branch line that ran north on Roncesvalles Avenue to Dundas Street. On December 14th, with the opening of the Bloor Viaduct, the Bloor streetcar would be extended east to Broadview Avenue. Finally, while an exact date isn't known, service on the Dufferin streetcar would be discontinued in 1918. In 1921, the Toronto Railway Company's 30-year operating charter had expired and the final years had left a bad taste in the city's mouth. Now, having gained experience through the operation of their own network, the City of Toronto would decide not to lease out operations again and would instead take control of Toronto's streetcar network. On September 1st, the city would officially merge its own Toronto Civic Railway with the former Toronto Railway Company lines to form the city's new municipally owned transit operator, the Toronto Transportation Commission. In the ensuing years, the TTC would dramatically change the city's streetcar network, including the introduction of new routes, the abolishment of others, and a near complete rebuild of the entire network's infrastructure. Firstly, on October 2, 1921, the Winchester streetcar would once again be rerouted. This time it would operate from the Y at Sumac Street, west to Parliament Street, south to Queen Street, and then west to an on-street loop via Church Street, Richmond Street, and Victoria Street. That same day, the Coxwell streetcar would enter service. This route would run from the intersection of Coxwell and Danforth, south to Queen Street. A day later, on October 3rd, the Broadview streetcar would enter service. This route operated from Luttrell Loop west on Danforth Avenue, south on Broadview Avenue into downtown Toronto, although I don't know exactly where its western terminus was. This would also end service on the Danforth streetcar. That same month, the Gerrard streetcar would be renamed to the Gerrard Main streetcar and its route changed. It would now operate south on Coxwell Avenue to Queen Street. The College streetcar would also see a revision to its route, as it would now operate south on Bay Street to Front Street before running through its pre-existing on-street loop. In November, the Bloor streetcar would be extended east to Coxwell Avenue. The western branch of the Bloor streetcar would also be renamed to Bloor West and extended west to a loop at Jane Street. On December 26th, the St. Clair streetcar would be cut back to Avenue Road. Concurrently, the Avenue Road streetcar would be extended west along St. Clair Avenue to Caledonia Loop. Finally, in December, the Bathurst streetcar would be extended north to an on-street loop via St. Clair Avenue and Vaughan Road. On February 22, 1922, the Harvard streetcar would be extended north to the new Royce Loop at DuPont Street. On April 2nd, the Lansdowne South streetcar would enter service. This route would run from the new Royce Loop south to a Y at Dundas Street. The pre-existing Lansdowne streetcar would be renamed to Lansdowne North. On June 27th, the Pape streetcar would enter service. This route would operate from the intersection of Pape and Danforth and then run south to Riverdale Avenue, west to Carlaw Avenue, and then south to Gerrard Street. On July 16th, the King streetcar would be extended, now operating west on Lakeshore Boulevard to the new Humber Loop. On August 16th, the Queen streetcar would enter service, not to be confused with the other Queen streetcar that's already in service. This route would operate from Sunnyside Loop east on Queen Street and Kingston Road to Victoria Park Avenue. On October 19th, the Gerrard Main streetcar would be extended north along Main Street and east on Danforth Avenue to Luttrell Loop. On November 2nd, the Yonge streetcar would be extended north to Glen Echo Loop. Lastly, on December 2nd, Queen streetcars would now terminate at the new Bingham Loop at Victoria Park Avenue. In 1923, Winchester and Queen streetcars would be merged. This route would now operate from a Y at Shumack Street, west to Parliament Street, south to Queen Street, and west to Sunnyside Loop. This merger, however, would only be temporary, as on June 30th, service on the Winchester and Queen streetcars would be ended. The Parliament streetcar would be restored, running from Winchester Street south to Queen Street and west to an on-street loop via Yonge Street, Front Street, and Bay Street. On May 24th, the Sunnyside streetcar would enter service. This route would operate during the summers and ran from Royce Loop south to Dundas Street, west along Howard Park Boulevard to Roncesvalles Avenue, and south to Lakeshore Boulevard and west to Humber Loop. July 1st, 1923 would be a big day for the network as multiple changes would take effect. Firstly, the King streetcar would see a major change to its route as it would absorb the Broadview streetcar and the Roncesvalles branch of the old Queen streetcar. The route would now operate from the new Arundel Loop at Broadview and Bloor, south to Queen Street, west on Queen Street and King Street, and then north on Roncesvalles Avenue to the new Vincent Loop at Dundas and Bloor. The Beach streetcar would also enter service on this day, running from the new Neville Park Loop to Humber Loop, replacing the service formerly provided by the King streetcar. The Carlton streetcar would see a change to its route as it would now operate from High Park Loop, east on Howard Park Avenue, Dundas Street and College Street, south on Parliament Street, and east on Carlton Street to Sword Street. The College streetcar would also see its route changed, now running from Royce Loop, south on Lansdowne Avenue, east on College Street, south on Bay Street, east on Dundas Street, north on Broadview Avenue, east on Gerrard Street, and north on Main Street. With this, service on the Gerrard Main streetcar would be ended. The St. Clair streetcar would also see service to Caledonia Loop restored on this day. The Avenue Road streetcar would be renamed to Bay and its route changed to run along Bay Street instead of Yonge Street. Coinciding with this, the DuPont streetcar would now be rerouted down Church Street instead of Yonge Street. Lastly, the Bloor streetcar would be extended east to Luttrell Loop. On July 23rd, service on the Beltline streetcar would be ended and the Sherburne and Spadina streetcars restored. The Sherburne streetcar specifically would now operate from Station Loop north on York Street, east on King Street, and then north on Sherburne Street to an on-street loop via Elm Avenue, Glen Road, and South Drive. The Spadina streetcar would operate from Bloor Street to Front Street. On November 15th, the TTC would assume control of the TSR's Crescent, Davenport, and Weston lines as the City of Toronto had annexed the town of West Toronto. As part of this, the Dundas streetcar would be extended west to Runnymede Loop. Its eastern terminus would also be changed as it would now terminate at City Hall Loop. service on the Weston Interurban would be cut back to Northlands Loop. On November 28th, service on the Crescent Streetcar would be ended. On December 16th, the College Streetcar would once again see a change in its route, as it would now turn north up Carlaw Avenue, east on Riverdale Avenue, and north on Pape Street to the new Lipton Loop at Bloor Street. With this, service on the Pape Streetcar would be ended. The Carlton Streetcar would now fill the missing service on Gerrard with an extension east on Gerrard, north on Main Street, and east on Danforth Avenue to Luttrell Loop. Finally, on December 23rd, the Dovercourt Streetcar would be extended north to a Y at Davenport Road. On January 1st, 1924, the Dovercourt Streetcar would be extended west to Old Weston Road and north to the new Townsley Loop at St. Clair Avenue. With that extension, service on the Davenport Streetcar would be reduced to a mere shuttle service running between Bathurst Street and Dovercourt Road. On May 1st, the Sherburne Streetcar would be cut back to Rosedale Loop. On August 3rd, the Parliament Streetcar would see a change to its route, as it would now be extended north to the new Viaduct Loop at Bloor Street. As well, the southern end of the route would be changed, as it would now perform an on-street loop via Church Street, Richmond Street, and Victoria Street. On September 19th, service on the Ashbridge Streetcar would be ended. On October 26th, the southern end of the Dovercourt Streetcar would change, as it would now run on an on-street loop via King Street, Crawford Street, and Adelaide Street. On November 19th, the Township of York Railways would begin operations as a subsidiary of the TTC, operating streetcar routes outside Toronto's municipal boundaries in the Township of York and Village of Weston. The TYR would be given the Weston and Lambton routes, while the TTC would operate them on the TYR's behalf. The TYR would also construct two new routes. The first being the Oakwood Streetcar, which would run from Oakwood Loop at St. Clair Avenue, north to Eglinton Avenue, and west to Gilbert Loop at Caledonia Road. The second new TYR route would be the Rogers Road Streetcar, which would run from Oakwood Loop north to Rogers Road and west to Dufferin Street. Service on the Weston Interurban would be restored, with streetcars once again operating to Church Street in the Village of Weston. On November 25th, the TYR would gain ownership of the Lambton Streetcar. Lastly, on December 1st, the St. Clair Streetcar would be extended east to the new Moore Park Loop at Mount Pleasant Road. On July 1st, 1925, the Dufferin Streetcar would be restored, but only operated as a shuttle service during the summer. The route would run between King Street and Dufferin Loop. On August 25th, after the construction of an underpass, the Bloor and Bloor West streetcars would be unified, creating a single crosstown route from Jane Loop to Luttrell Loop. On August 29th, the Rogers Road streetcar would be extended west along Rogers Road to Bicknell Loop, just west of Keele Street. On August 31st, service on the Sunnyside streetcar would be ended. On November 4th, the eastern end of the St. Clair streetcar would be extended north on Mount Pleasant Road to Eglinton Loop at Eglinton Avenue. Lastly, by the mid-1920s, the DuPont streetcar route had been changed, with it now operating on Bay Street and terminating at City Hall Loop. On May 22, 1926, the Ferry streetcar would enter service. This was a temporary shuttle service while Toronto's new Union Station was under construction. This route operated from a loop at the ferry terminal north on its own right-of-way to an on-street loop via Front Street, Yonge Street, Queen Street, and Bay Street. Lastly, service on the Woodbridge Interurban would be ended. On January 12, 1927, the TTC would take control of the Toronto and York Radial Railway and begin operating its interurban lines. The Metropolitan Interurban would be renamed Lake Simcoe. The Mimico and Scarborough interurban lines would be unchanged. On May 23rd, the Spadina streetcar would be extended south to Lakeshore Boulevard. Lastly, on June 3rd, the southern terminus of the ferry streetcar would be changed, as after crossing the railway tracks, the line would now run south on Bay Street and west on Queens Quay to a new loop at York Street. A couple of months later, on August 1st, the ferry streetcar would be merged with the Bay streetcar. On January 27, 1928, the Queen streetcar would be extended east to a new loop at Birchmount Road. On August 28th, service on the Lambton streetcar would be ended. On September 27th, the TTC would end service on the Mimico Interurban line. 3 months later, on December 8th, the Lakeshore streetcar would enter service to replace the lost Mimico line. The Lakeshore streetcar would operate from the new Long Branch Loop east along Lakeshore Boulevard and Queen Street to an on-street loop via Church Street, Richmond Street, and Victoria Street. Service into the village of Port Credit would be handled by the new Port Credit streetcar, which operated from Long Branch Loop west to Stavebank Road. Coinciding with the creation of the Lakeshore streetcar, service on the Beach streetcar would be cut back to McCall Loop. On February 18, 1929, service on the Queen streetcar would be cut back to McCall Loop. On March 16, 1930, the TTC would end service on the Lake Simcoe Interurban. 4 months later, on July 17th, the TTC would establish the North Young Railway subsidiary, which would operate the new North Young Interurban. This route would operate from Glen Echo Loop to Richmond Hill. On November 3rd, Dundas streetcars would now begin accessing City Hall Loop via new track laid on Elizabeth Street. With the opening of Toronto's new Union Station, streetcars serving the old one at the old station loop would now be redirected to the new Simcoe Loop. On April 13, 1931, the northern terminus of the Church streetcar would be changed to the new Asquith Loop on Church Street. On June 22nd, the Fort streetcar would enter service. This route operated from Wolseley Loop south on Bathurst Street and west on Fleet Street to Fleet Loop. On August 15th, service on the Guelph Interurban ended and the Toronto Suburban Railway shut down. On October 29th, the St. Clair streetcar would be extended to Townsley Loop. Lastly, in 1931, Bay and DuPont streetcars would begin running on newly installed tracks on Davenport Road between Bay Street and DuPont. By the early 1930s, the eastern terminus of the Lakeshore streetcar had been slightly changed, as streetcars would now loop via Victoria, Richmond, and York Streets. On May 4th, the St. Clair streetcar would be extended west to the new Keele Loop. On February 19, 1933, Sherburne streetcars would now begin terminating at the new Frederick Loop. On April 1st, service on the College streetcar would end. The Harbord streetcar would be rerouted to Lipton Loop to replace the lost service provided by the College streetcar. On April 3rd, with the construction of an underpass, the Lansdowne North and South streetcars would be unified, operating from Earls Court Loop to College Street. On February 9, 1935, service on the Port Credit streetcar would be ended. On October 28th, service on the Lakeshore streetcar would be cut back in the west to Parkside Loop. The eastern end of the route would be extended east to the new Mutual Loop on Mutual Street. To make up for the lost service in the west end, the Long Branch streetcar would begin service. This route would run from Long Branch Loop to Roncesvalles Carhouse. By the mid-1930s, the Bathurst streetcar had seen a change to its route, as it now ran east on Adelaide Street to an on-street loop via Church, Richmond, and Victoria Streets. On March 14, 1936, Long Branch streetcars would begin using the new Roncesvalles Loop. On June 25th, service on the Scarborough Interurban was ended. On August 2nd, 1937, the Lakeshore and Beach streetcars would be merged together to form a new Queen streetcar, which operated from Parkside Loop to Neville Park Loop. The old Queen streetcar would be renamed to Kingston Road. 1939 would see the onset of World War II, and just like with the first one, Toronto's streetcar network would play a pivotal role in moving residents and workers around the city as oil, rubber, and steel were rationed. Just like with World War I, the next 6 years would take their toll on the network. For the duration of World War II, the Fort streetcar would begin terminating at the new Exhibition Loop, as the exhibition grounds had once again become a staging ground for troops and supplies heading to Europe. On May 24th, the Sunnyside streetcar would be restored, with its route now operating from Earls Court Loop to Parkside Loop. On May 9th, 1940, the Lansdowne streetcar would begin following an on-street loop at its southern end via Dundas and College Streets. On December 31st, service on the Davenport streetcar was ended. Lastly, in 1940, the southern terminus of the Coxwell streetcar would be moved to a new off-street loop at Queen Street. On August 21, 1941, service on the Dufferin streetcar would be ended again. On April 23, 1942, the Bathurst streetcar would begin terminating at the new Vaughan Loop. On October 26th, service on the Long Branch streetcar would be extended west to the new Small Arms Loop in Port Credit. On October 13, 1945, the Long Branch streetcar would be cut back to Long Branch Loop in the west. In the aftermath of the war, the city's streetcar network was in a dire state. The combination of higher than normal ridership mixed with the deferred maintenance due to war rationing had taken its toll on the network. The TTC would have to look long and hard at what it wanted to do going forward, as even if rationing was ended, both money and steel were in short supply as the country's economy transitioned back into peacetime mode. This issue, compounded with the coming dominance of car culture, would bring about an era of contraction in the streetcar network, as many routes would disappear from city streets. The streetcar network had reached its peak, and we have now entered the era of the streetcar abandonment policy. Firstly, on January 5, 1947, the Parliament streetcar would be extended south on Parliament Street to a new off-street loop at King Street. That same day, however, service on the Sherbourne streetcar would be ended. On June 19th, service on the Lansdowne streetcar would be ended. On December 8th, service on the Dovercourt streetcar would be ended. Because of this, the Harbour streetcar would now be routed north up Dovercourt Road, west on Davenport Road, and north on Old Weston Road to Townsley Loop. On September 13, 1948, service on the Weston Interurban would be ended. On October 9th, service on the North Yonge Interurban would be ended, and with it, Toronto's last interurban line was gone. A day later, on October 10th, service on the Spadina streetcar would be ended. On August 18, 1950, the Dufferin streetcar would see a change to its route, as its northern terminus would now be an on-street loop via east on King Street, north on Shaw Street, and west on Queen Street back to Dufferin. This wouldn't last long, however, as a month later on September 13th, service on the Dufferin streetcar would be ended for good. On February 25, 1953, the province of Ontario would establish the Municipality of Metropolitan Toronto. This new regional government would be made up of the City of Toronto and 12 other municipalities, with its focus on integrating the region together. Relevant to this video is the TTC would now be controlled by the regional government and not the City of Toronto proper. This is important because it now meant that the TTC's operational mandate now encompassed the entire region and not just the city. Because of this, the Township of York Railways no longer served a purpose, so its routes were folded into the TTC, leaving the Toronto Transit Commission as the sole transit operator in Toronto. On March 7, 1954, the Yonge streetcar would be cut back to Eglinton Avenue. This would be a prelude of what was to come. On March 30th, the Yonge subway would open, and it would have immediate impacts on the streetcar network. Firstly, service on the Yonge streetcar would be ended, ending 93 years of service. Canada's first streetcar line was gone. However, that same day, the Earls Court streetcar would enter service. This route would operate from St. Clair Station and then west to Earls Court Loop at Lansdowne Avenue. The next day, on March 31st, service on the Bay streetcar would be ended. The DuPont streetcar would be routed south on Bay Street to York Loop to maintain service to the ferry terminal. On May 15th, service on the Church streetcar would be ended. On July 1st, the east end of the Kingston Road streetcar would be cut back to Bingham Loop. In 1955, the east end of the Carlton streetcar would be cut back to a new off-street loop at Main Street and Danforth. In 1957, as part of construction of the Gardiner Expressway, the Queen streetcar would be extended west along the Queensway to the new Humber Loop. The Long Branch streetcar would also begin terminating at the new Humber Loop. That year, the west end of the Harbour streetcar would also be cut back to St. Clarence Loop at Davenport and St. Clarence Avenue. On May 15, 1958, the southern end of the Bathurst streetcar would be changed. The route would now follow an on-street loop via east on Adelaide Street, north on Church Street, west on Richmond Street, south on York Street, and west on Adelaide back to Bathurst Street. On January 1, 1960, service on the Oakwood streetcar would be ended. On June 13th, the Bathurst streetcar would once again see a change in its route. The southern end of the line would now loop via east on Adelaide Street, south on Church Street, and west on King Street. On June 1, 1961, due to the construction of Toronto's new City Hall, the Dundas streetcar would begin running down Bay Street to access City Hall Loop. On February 28, 1963, the University extension of the Yonge subway would open, and with it, service on the DuPont streetcar would be ended. On February 26, 1966, the Bloor-Danforth subway line would open and multiple streetcar lines would disappear from the map. On this day, service on the Harbour streetcar would be ended. Service on the Parliament streetcar would be ended. Service on the Fleet streetcar would be ended. In its place, the Bathurst streetcar would be extended south to Exhibition Loop. However, the Bathurst streetcar would also see the north end of its route cut back to Bathurst Station. Lastly, service on the Bloor streetcar would be ended between Woodbine and Keele stations. The Bloor streetcar would continue to operate as a shuttle between Keele Station and Jane Loop. The Danforth streetcar would be restored, operating as a shuttle between Woodbine Station and Luttrell Loop. 2 days later, on February 28th, service on the Coxwell streetcar would be ended. On May 11, 1968, the Bloor-Danforth subway would be extended to Warden Station in the east and Islington Station in the west. Concurrent with this, service on the Bloor streetcar would be ended. Service on the Danforth streetcar would also be ended. Lastly, the Dundas streetcar would be cut back to Dundas West Station. By the 1970s, the TTC had ended the streetcar abandonment policy. The network would now largely stagnate until the 1990s, when expansion of the network really started up again for the first time since World War II. The 70s would also see the rollout of the new CLRV and ALRV streetcars, and routes would now start receiving numbers. On April 2, 1973, the 502 Downtowner streetcar would enter service. This route would run from Bingham Loop west on Kingston Road and Queen Street and north on Bathurst Street to Bathurst Station. Lastly, by the 1970s, the 503 Kingston Road streetcar had seen a change to the western end of its route. It would now operate west on King Street to an on-street loop via Church, Wellington, and York Streets. On July 21, 1974, service on the Rogers Road streetcar would be ended. On September 4th, the 502 Downtowner would be cut back to McCall Loop at its west end. On January 6, 1975, the east end of the 505 Dundas would be changed, as it would now follow an on-street loop via Church, Richmond, and Victoria Streets. On March 30th, the eastern end of the 512 St. Clair between St. Clair Station and Eglinton Loop would be spun off into its own route, that being the Mount Pleasant streetcar. This would be short-lived though, as after only 15 months of service, on July 24, 1976, service on the Mount Pleasant streetcar would be ended. In 1978, service on the 512L Earls Court would be ended. On July 27, 1981, the 512 St. Clair would be extended west to the new Guns Loop at Guns Road. On June 20, 1986, the 505 Dundas would be extended east on Dundas Street and north on Broadview Avenue to Broadview Station. On June 22, 1990, the 604 Harbourfront would enter service. This route would run from Union Station south in a tunnel to Queens Quay and then run west to an off-street loop on Spadina Avenue. On January 26, 1992, the Lakeshore streetcar would be reinstated and given the number 508. This route would operate from Long Branch Loop and east along Lakeshore Boulevard and the Queensway and King Street to Parliament Street. On March 26, 1995, the 507 Long Branch would be merged into the 501 Queen, forming a route from Neville Park Loop in the east to Long Branch Loop in the west. On June 16, 1996, a new exhibition loop would open. On July 27, 1997, the Spadina streetcar would be reinstated and given the number 510. This route would also absorb the 604 Harbourfront and operate from Spadina Station to Union Station. On July 1, 2000, the Harbourfront streetcar would be reinstated and given the number 509. The route would now run from Union Station to Exhibition Loop via Queens Quay and Fleet Street. On June 18, 2016, the 514 Cherry would enter service. The route would operate from Dufferin Loop north to King Street, east to Schumacher Street, and south to the new Cherry Loop. On October 6, 2018, the TTC would decide to split the 504 King into two routes in a bid to increase service through the downtown core. The new 504A would operate from Dundas West Station to Cherry Loop. The new 504B would operate from Broadview Station to Dufferin Loop. As a consequence of this, service on the 514 Cherry would be ended. In January 2020, service on the 502 Downtowner would be ended. On June 22nd, the 503 Kingston Road would be extended west to Charlotte Loop. On November 19, 2023, the 507 Long Branch was split off from the 501 Queen, now running its old route from Long Branch Loop to Humber Loop. I'm not going to speculate on what the future of the streetcar network may look like, as there are many plans, from changes to current routes to the introduction of new ones, and this video is long enough as it is. But there it is, 176 years of history, from its primordial origins as a simple stagecoach service to the modern streetcar network it is today. It grew rapidly during the 20th century and contracted even faster in the post-war years, yet here it remains carrying tens of thousands of passengers every day. It's crazy to think that all of this happened because a simple cabinet maker, Bert Williams, tried his hand at running a stagecoach service in Toronto 176 years ago. While some may decry them as old-fashioned and obstructive, the simple fact remains that without the streetcars, Toronto wouldn't be the city it is today, and they have become an integral part of the city's identity. The streetcars helped build Toronto, and they will continue to do so for years to come. And with that, I'll end this video here. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the evolution of Toronto's streetcar network, don't be afraid to do so in the comment section down below. And remember, if you're looking for something a bit more in depth, I have an entire playlist full of videos that go through each route in much more detail. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.